Hi, I'm Saskia van Nouhuis, and I'm a professor of ecology at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. Today I'm going to do, the presentation I'm going to give is a case study in the topics of food webs. So the last lecture I gave was all about food webs, and this is going to be diving into one specific food web. So in the last lecture, I talked about food webs. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about a subset of the topics in food web using this one food web, which I've been working in for many years. To put this into a context, researchers look at food webs in many different environments. So for example, this is a food web in the sea, in the far north. So there's polar bears as sort of high up predators, and then algae and things as the primary producers. There's another example is tropical grasslands, or any kind of grasslands where we have grass as the primary producers, and then we have lots of different types of herbivores and organisms that eat those herbivores. We can look at food webs in the soil. So this is what's going on down in the soil. Many arthropods and some microorganism, fungi and things. And we can, in food webs, we can also take into account, so we can look at the macroorganisms, but we can also take into account the microorganisms that may be parasites of, or symbionts with, or competitors with these macroorganisms. And then we can also look at food webs that have different kinds of primary producers. So mostly I've talked about situations in which photosynthesizers are the primary producers gaining their energy from light. But you can have primary producers which are not gaining their energy from light. They can be getting, say, chemical energy. And so, for example, these chemosynthetic bacteria that are in hydrothermal vents in the ocean may be the primary producers in these deep ocean food webs. So there's lots of different kinds of food webs. But a lot of the Earth, especially the terrestrial Earth, has plants, and then the organisms that are associated with these plants. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about this system just to start out with. So the main plant species in this system is ribwort plantain, or Plantago lanceolata. And then it has herbivores that feed on it, and it has parasitoids that feed on those herbivores, and it has hyperparasitoids. There are, of course, other species, other types of organisms that interact in this system, but these are the ones that interact very closely with each other, meaning where their population sizes are really intertwined. So with this food web, we can sort of address many different aspects of ecology, and especially community ecology, which come up in this course. I'm not going to do all of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we talked about last lecture, about why is the world green. I'm going to give some examples of the effects of direct and indirect interactions, direct competition and apparent competition. I'm going to talk about the effects of habitat fragmentation on food chain length, or on the complexity of food webs. And then bring that all together in the, going back to the concept which I talked about also in the last lecture, which is the alternation of mechanisms of population limitation at different trophic levels. All right, so I'm starting with one, why the world is green. So last time we talked about this HSS, Hairston, Smith, and Slobodkin theory or idea of why the world is green. And so what we see here is the research system which is dominated by this plant, Plantago lanceolata. And so all of these plants here, all these little plants here, and then quite a lot of the plants here in this background are all Plantago lanceolata. So in that sense, in this scenario, the world is green, meaning every year, come spring, Plantago grow up and there gets to be really a lot of Plantago and it's green. And what that means is that the Plantago are not being, are not being limited by the things that are eating them. So if Plantago is limited by what was eating it, then it would be all eaten up and it wouldn't be here and then it wouldn't be green. Okay, so Plantago is eaten by a bunch of different herbivores. And the main herbivore is Melittea sphinxia, the Glanville fritillary butterfly. And so this is a picture of some gregarious caterpillars of Melittea sphinxia that are feeding on a Plantago plant. You see these little brown guys. And when those guys get bigger, they look like this. So here they are, another plant, and they've actually eaten this whole plant, but there's other Plantago around. So this is the herbivore that eats the most of this plant. So if the world is green, then that means that something else is limiting this butterfly population size besides food availability, right? Because the food is Plantago. And so if food availability were limiting it, then we wouldn't see so much Plantago. So what is limiting the population sizes of this butterfly? That's the question. So one of the things that's limiting its population size is its parasitoids. So parasitoid wasps are kind of like predators. They have a consumer resource relationship with their host. So parasitoids lay their eggs in or on the hosts, and then the offspring consume the host and grow up. So parasitoids are one of the things that are limiting the butterfly. In this system, the other thing that's limiting the butterfly, which is not part of the HSS scenario, but probably is part of quite a lot of the world, is weather. So weather is variable seasonally and also and variable year to year and time to time. And you can have some like episodes of drought or episodes of flood or extremely cold or extremely hot times. Those turn out to have a large effect on this butterfly. So, and you can think of it as in two ways. One of them is the butterfly adults are flying in the summer. And if the summer is super hot and dry, which some summers are, the butterfly adults don't live very long, and so because they basically don't have enough to drink, they can't, and they desiccate, and so they don't have time to lay very many eggs, and so they have a smaller population size. So summer hotness is one of the problems for the adult oviposition. And then the second problem, which is illustrated here, so you see this kind of smoky looking stuff that's on this plants, that's the silk that's made by these caterpillars. So you can see these caterpillars, they, as they're feeding gregariously, they make silk, so you can sort of see where they have been. And so this is the silk of those caterpillars. And this is a dead Plantago plant. And the reason that it's dead is because it's the late summer when they're feeding in this year was very dry, and so the plants died. And so in general, in years that have that are not too hot or not too cold, then the butterfly does very well. In years that are too hot or too cold, then the butterfly doesn't do very well. So these two things, parasitoids that respond to butterfly density and weather that don't respond to butterfly density but can have a big effect some years and not other years, are what control the butterfly population. So it's not directly plant availability. Okay, so that was one. Why is the world green? The world is green because the herbivore is controlled by various mechanisms besides direct resource limitation. A second aspect of food webs that we can get at looking at this food web is the effects of competition. Okay, so we have this main herbivore in the system, and this main herbivore has three main parasitoids. And so what I'm going to address now is competition among the parasitoids. Okay, so two of these parasitoids, this one and this one, only use this one host species. So in that sense, they're competitors, because species that use exactly the same resources in the same place are competitors. This other parasitoid also uses some other hosts as well, and we'll get to the consequences of that later. But it nonetheless parasitizes a lot of this Melittea sphinxia, and so it's a competitor with these other two parasitoids. Okay, so the question is then, what is the effect? One question is, are they competing? So for example, if there was a lot of butterflies available, then there might be lots of different parasitoids, and it would be sort of hard to see whether they are competing or not. But if there's a limiting resource, then we're likely to be able to see the competition among parasitoids. So it turns out that studying what's the result and sort of mechanism of competition among these species is extremely complicated, and took decades of work with many different people looking at many different aspects of the competition between these species. Okay, so it's what is the effect of one population size on another population? What's the mechanism of competition? At what point in their life stage, as adults or as immature, are they competing? Lots of different sort of aspects of the competitive interaction go into one can go into many different aspects of that competitive interaction. And so I'm not going to explain any of these. I'm just going to say that there's been a lot of different research about the competitive interactions among these three parasitoids. And the sum of it is that this generalist parasitoid is probably the least affected by competition, meaning its population size has the least negative effect due to the other two parasitoids. And this parasitoid, which is Cotesia melitarum, is the most affected by competition, and this one is intermediately affected. Okay, so these three parasitoids have an effect on each other's population sizes, and they don't have an equal effect on each other's population sizes because they have different natural histories and different relationships with the host. And so the most obvious one is to think about this parasitoid, Pteromalis apum. It has other hosts, so it's not so dependent on this one host, and so its population size doesn't get so affected by these other parasitoids, for example. Okay. All right. So then we can look and say, okay, so we know the parasitoids are competing with each other, and we know about their resource use. And we can say then this third trophic level, the parasitoids, what limits their populations? So one of the things that limits their populations is the amount of the butterflies that are around. And then if we look among the different parasitoid species, the different species affect each other's population sizes negatively because they're competing. And then the third thing that affects their population sizes is the fourth trophic level, the hyperparasitoids, right? So just like these parasitoids can affect the population sizes of the host herbivores, the hyperparasitoid can affect the population size, negatively affect the population size of the primary parasitoids. So these guys are sandwiched between their enemies and their resource. And in a way you could say that these butterflies are also sandwiched between their enemies and their resource is the plant. Okay, so I talked really briefly about one interaction, which is competition among the parasitoids. Now I'm going to talk about a slightly more complex interaction, which is we call apparent competition. So this one I mentioned, this mechanism, this type of interaction has been mentioned a couple of times actually in this course. So apparent competition, competition is when two species have a negative effect on each other, or in some cases one has a negative effect on the other and the other one isn't so affected. But usually it's both of them negative. And apparent competition is when it looks like two species have a negative effect on each other, but it's really but that negative association isn't because of any direct interaction between them, but it's because of their shared interaction with an enemy. Okay. So in this particular food web, the question I ask is there apparent competition between these two butterfly species, Melittea sphinxia and Melittea athalia, due to a shared enemy? So the shared enemy is this parasitoid, Pteromalus apum. And these two parasitoids, they do both, the Melittea sphinxia feeds on that ribwort plantain, and the Melittea athalia feeds a little bit on that, but it feeds on many other plants. So they are not direct, so they're not directly competing for food. But they do share this natural enemy. So the prediction is that having them both there what makes the resource density high for the Pteromalus apum. So having both of them there rather than just one of them there makes a large resource pool for the parasitoid. And that large resource pool, the parasitoid will respond in a density dependent way to that large resource pool, and then its population will be greater. And so having more of the resource there will be negative for both butterfly species, because the natural enemy is responding to the high density of the pooled resource of both. Okay, so that was a prediction, and then we did an experiment to test that prediction. The experiment is, so we put those two host species out in the field in natural-ish environments, both in patches that they were separate from each other and patches where they were together. So this is a picture of one of the host plants, and this is I don't know if you can see it, but it's a caterpillar who's about to pupate. So this parasitoid parasitizes the pupae. So we put the caterpillar on this plant, and we put these potted plants out in the field site. And so he's putting the plant, and then he's putting this mesh fabric over it, which has holes that are big enough to let that parasitoid through, but doesn't let other things through. So we know that there's not other things going on besides potentially parasitism by this very small wasp. So we put these out under 3 different conditions. So one host species alone. Each one of these circles is a pot with a pupa on it. The other host species alone, so that's A and B. And then C, like those 2 things superimposed on each other, a situation in which both host species are present in the environment. So when both host species are present, it's not just that there's a choice between the 2 host species, but the total density is higher. And so then you might expect that the parasitoid, if it arrives in that patch, it's going to stick around there because there's a lot of resources there. Okay, so then there's these 3 kinds of plots, and we replicated these 3 kinds of plots at 11 different meadows twice in 2 different years. Okay, so that's a replicated experiment. All right. So if there were apparent competition, then we would expect that the rate of parasitism of both species would be high when they were found together in that high density scenario, compared to when they're found alone, which is the low density scenario. And in this case, it would be that the presence of the other species would be negative for both host species, right? Both host species would be better off, meaning experience less parasitism if they were alone. Okay, so what did we find? What we found was that there was really, what we found you can see most illustrated if we look at the Melittea sphinxia results. So we found that the rate of parasitism is higher when it's alone than when it's together, meaning that in the presence of the second host species, the Melittea sphinxia is parasitized less. So in this case, we can think of it as they are actually gaining from the presence of the other species. Okay, so this isn't quite the outcome we were expecting of simple apparent competition. But it is quite closely related to apparent competition, because it means the presence of the 2 species has a positive effect on one, and probably also has a negative effect on the other, although we didn't see it. Okay, so we didn't really get quite apparent competition. but we did get an effect of the other species. And then the next question is, well, why do we see this difference? Why does parasitism of one species go down when the two species are together? And we think this is because this is a pupa of Meltia athalia, the one who's parasitized at a higher rate. And then inside of here, there's like this silk bag. And then there's the pupa of the Meltia syncytia. And so the Meltia syncytia makes this silk bag around it. And so it's actually harder for the parasitoid to get to that pupa. And so what it probably means is that in an environment where both types of hosts are available, the Meltia athalia is just way easier to parasitize. And so given the choice or given the encounter rate, they're going to end up parasitizing more of the Meltia athalia than they are the Meltia syncytia. And so that's why, and so that's a mechanism by which we can get a lower parasitism of Meltia syncytia if they have the option of having Meltia athalia around. Okay, so again, this is a test of the notion of apparent competition, which didn't quite come out as straightforward apparent competition, but is nonetheless an indirect interaction between the two host species. Okay, now I'm going to go to the third aspect of food webs that I'm going to look at using this food web. So if you remember back to the module that we had on population dynamics, I gave a case study of Meltia syncytia and talking about whether Meltia syncytia lives in a metapopulation. And so and this is Meltia syncytia, and this is the Åland Islands, which I showed you some pictures of in that lecture. Okay, so it turns out that all of this work is done in the Åland Islands. Okay, so I told you about the butterfly and where it's found in the Åland Islands and its population dynamics. And I didn't bother to, at that point, tell you about its parasitoids. But it also has, all over the Åland Islands, these parasitoids in the food web that I've been talking about. Okay, so one thing about the Åland Islands is there's these habitat patches. And so in these, in this picture, each little circle is a meadow suitable for the butterfly. It's not necessarily there. It's only in 500 out of the 3,000 habitat patches. But each circle is suitable for the butterfly. And then the circles are sort of colored by clusters of habitat patches. So because of the geography and because of the agricultural sort of landscape and the forest and the water and blah, 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 the habitat patches are kind of clustered. So habitat patches that are clustered together we think of as sort of one network of habitat patches. And then there's either space or forest or water in between networks of habitat patches. Some networks of habitat patches are big and the patches are close together, and some networks of habitat patches are small and the patches are far apart. Some patch networks are far away from where any of the other species are, so they're kind of isolated, and some are sort of right in the middle of everything. And so what you end up having, because of this distribution of habitat patches, is kind of a sampling of different amounts of habitat fragmentation. So you have very fragmented or very isolated habitat patches or habitat patch networks, and then you have very concentrated, clustered habitat patches that are not so fragmented. Okay, so in this one environment, you have this gradation of habitat fragmentation. But overall, the habitats are fragmented in the sense that there's these isolated meadows, and individuals would have to move between the meadows in order to get to new potential populations. Okay, so let's just think a little bit about habitat fragmentation in general. So you could imagine these little shapes are habitat patches that are available to some herbivore, say a butterfly. But the butterfly isn't in all of those habitat patches. And so if you look at the habitat patches that are available for a parasitoid, it's a subset of those, right? So the parasitoid is experiencing a more sparse environment than the butterfly. if you look at the hyperparasitoid, the parasitoid isn't in all of the patches that the butterfly is in just by chance. And so the hyperparasitoid experiences an even sparser habitat. So in general, in a fragmented habitat, as you move up the food chain, then the species at higher and higher levels are experiencing a more and more sparse landscape. They have less resource availability, and the resources are harder to access, and you could think of it in some sense as the resources are not as reliably present as you move up the food chain. Okay, so thinking of it in that context, where you have the different trophic levels and you have the different trophic levels and you have different amounts of fragmentation, we can ask, where in the fragmented landscape do each of these interacting species occur and why? All right. So some other information that's related to that is, well, one thing that would affect where they occur and why is how general their resource use is. So a generalist species could use resources in multiple different habitat types. So for example, this hyperparasitoid Gallus is a hyperparasitoid of many different parasitoids. And so they are not restricted to any one specific habitat type, in which case they don't experience an environment that's as fragmented as it would be if they were specialist hyperparasitoids. So degree of generalization is one factor that affects that the effects of fragmentation is affected by. Another factor is dispersal ability. So if something is not very dispersive, then the environment is effectively more fragmented for them than if they're very dispersive. So this parasitoid, Hyposoda horticola, is extremely dispersive. It's much more dispersive than its host butterfly. So in a way, it experiences a less fragmented habitat than its butterfly, which is kind of unusual. Okay, so dispersal behavior or ability affects the effect of fragmentation as well as resource breadth. Okay, so we've done lots of surveying all over the Åland Islands, and we know in general where all of the species in these food chains exist. And so I'm summarizing this as, if you go to the main Åland Islands in areas that are sort of right in the middle, in the thick of everything, where the habitat patches are clustered together, we see the butterfly, we see both of its main parasitoids, and we see both of its main hyperparasitoids. But if we go to an isolated area, which in this case, these are islands over here, you have to go in a boat to get to them. There are actually pretty many habitat patches, but since this is an island, if they become locally extinct, then they don't become recolonized again for a long time because there's this water in between. So there's not these sources of colonists available. And so this is a very isolated area. Okay, so if we go to these islands and we look at these different islands, in some of the places, not all of them, the butterfly is present. And where the butterfly is present, we do find this very dispersive parasitoid, but we don't find its specialist hyperparasitoid. So in this case, in this food chain, we lose one player in the food chain because it's a specialist and the environment is too fragmented, it's too sparse for this specialist parasitoid to persist over time. And then we don't find this second parasitoid. So we find this first parasitoid, but not the second parasitoid. And the reason we don't find the second parasitoid is because it's not very dispersive. And so it's in a habitat patch, it would rarely leave that habitat patch. So if the host becomes extinct locally, it's not able to fly to a different place and find new patches. And so it's not present in the sparse environment. But its hyperparasitoid, even though it's not there, its hyperparasitoid is present. And that's because that hyperparasitoid is a generalist. So it has other hosts, we don't even know what all its hosts are, that are present in this sparse environment. So in the not sparse environment, we've got all five of these species. In the sparse environment, sometimes we don't have any of these species, but where we have the host, then we just have two of the parasitoids. We have the one that's dispersive and the one that is a generalist. And what we've lost is the two parasitoids that are specialists and not dispersive. Okay? So we can think of these two that are not present as resource limited because they're in a sparse, fragmented environment. Okay, so then we can bring this all together and look at what limits each of the trophic levels in this food web. So this sort of harkens back to the previous lecture in which I was talking about this alternation of explanations of what limits the population sizes at different trophic levels. All right, so starting at the first trophic level, we didn't talk about this much. This is the plants. So plants get their energy from the sun, but they also need nutrients and water from the soil. And yeah, and so I didn't talk about that, but they're limited by their resources and weather. The second trophic level, the butterfly, we're going to talk about. We're not talking about these ones in this lecture. The butterfly is limited by the enemy, as you would expect according to the HSS, why is the world green hypothesis. But they are also quite strongly limited by weather. And in fact, weather is actually the main limitation in this system. And it may be the main limitation in many systems. Okay, so it's limited by weather and it's limited by enemies, the trophic level above. If we look at the third trophic level, the parasitoids, we want to know what limits the population size of the parasitoids. Well, they're limited by the resource availability. If there was more butterflies, there would be more parasitoids. Among the different species of parasitoids, they limit each other through competition, but that doesn't really limit the trophic level, it just limits who is in the trophic level. And they are also limited strongly by the fourth trophic level, their enemies. Okay? So so there is kind of an alternation of limitation due to the different things. But there's a little bit of slop, mostly because of the effect of weather. Then you can ask, okay, this fourth trophic level, what's limiting it? Okay, and we saw in this previous slide, what's limiting it, in some cases, is habitat fragmentation. But in a larger sense, what's limiting the fourth trophic level is resource availability. So for the generalist, it gets over that by having more other resources. So it's not actually resource limited, so it's there. And then for the hyperparasitoid that didn't manage to persist, it's a specialist, so it is resource limited, or it could be resource limited. And then the habitat has become so fragmented that there aren't very much of the resources for it. Okay, so this fourth trophic level is resource limited. And so we basically see this alternation of sort of drivers of population limitation with the addition of weather. Okay, so I'm going to summarize what I have used this one trophic web as an example of. So we looked at, is the world green? And to some extent this model fits that in that the plants are the herbivores are not limited by the amount of plants, meaning they are not eating all the plants, and so they're allowed to be green. And the other thing that's affecting them is the plants is the weather. So that's why the world is green. We looked at some of the direct and indirect interactions. The competition among the parasitoids, especially these two parasitoids who have no other hosts besides Meltia syncytia. There's strong competition between these parasitoids. It's super complex. Thinking about just like who's the winner in the parasitoids takes many different experiments, but that competition is there. I went over a test of apparent competition of this parasitoid, Pteromelis apum, who can use both Meltia syncytia and another parasitoid, another butterfly, Meltia athalia. we didn't exactly find apparent competition, but we did find an indirect interaction between the butterflies due to the shared enemy. Then I talked about the effects of habitat fragmentation for food chain length. And so, and this sort of connects the lecture that we have had about food webs with the lecture that we had about spatial ecology and habitat fragmentation. And then I summed this up to say, within food webs, does this food web, the specific one, sort of fit the model of alternating explanations for population limitation at the different trophic levels? So resource, enemy, resource, enemy, resource, enemy. And we see that it kind of does that with a little bit of slop. And I guess in ecology, mostly what we find is that things kind of fit patterns and there's also slop. Okay, so that's the end of this case study about food webs. Thanks.